Hello, my name is David Santillana. I'm making a video for Communications 3260, in which I'm going to be talking about Emily Bernard's book, Black is the Body, and the chapter in it called Going Home. This chapter is about Emily's trip home after her grandmother dies. She's going back to her family's hometown in Hazelhurst, Mississippi, and she's gonna go to a funeral, and she's gonna talk to some relatives and come home, essentially. While it should be that simple, there's a lot of content and details that happen in between those two things. And so, yeah, to kind of get into it, she starts off by talking about her experience going to an airport, and how she seems to be in a very race conscious state of mind at the airport. She is noticing all of the different Black people and all the different backgrounds that they come from and all the different jobs that they're having to do at the airport. And then she notices white people and how even today they seem to just be living different types of lives. The only white people that she mentions in this chapter, or at the beginning of this chapter, are there's a white businessman wearing a suit, two white businessmen wearing suits, and a person who comes up to her and invades her personal space and is very chatty and kind of a little bit like oblivious to Emily's personal privacy and space. So I've always heard that people in the Northeast have like this just different attitude about other people, where it's kind of like we're all having to share the same space. You know, it's very important that you respect my privacy, I respect your privacy, and so on and so forth. But this lady from North Carolina, the white lady that comes up to Emily, she is just completely unaware of this idea. And so another thing that I thought was really interesting was this experience that Emily had while waiting amongst a lot of white people. She notices one other Black person and how they kind of acknowledge each other. She writes that they smile at each other, and that the smile says, "You are here and I am here too. And isn't it interesting the way things turn out?" And I just think that, like, it must be very difficult to have that experience of camaraderie where you don't know each other, but somehow you know so much about each other and what the other person is thinking, and kind of like communicating through their body language and through their facial expressions. And I thought that that was really interesting. It seems like there's two worlds going on. Oh, and then the next thing that happened in the airport that I thought was interesting was how there was a moment where Emily had to make a decision about approaching a desk, and it was between her and a white man, and how she just decided to, you know what, I'm just gonna walk up. I'm not gonna, think too much about this, and how, well, she ultimately does think about it quite a lot, because it seems like Emily is always kind of working on this type of stuff. But she just approaches the desk, and how she thinks to herself, historically, this would be a very controversial and very bold move to do. I think that that's probably something that happens on a very frequent basis, that still has underlying kind of things going on that we don't really notice, unless you're Emily Bernard, then you notice. So that kind of sets the mood. She is going back home to a predominantly Black area, and that is very rich in Black history, and her family's history, which is Black. It is very heavily impacted by the history of Black Americans because they were living on the forefront of the civil rights movement, and they were the people who were, I think, some of the people who were most affected by those times. This is where Emily sort of talks about and connects to those roots that define her very career today. And she talks about the first time she, looked into this type of stuff, and how her family responded. And then she talks about how her family went through this kind of stuff and how they responded to the events themselves. Emily arrives in Hazelhurst. Emily talks about how her grandmother, when she at the funeral, Emily starts to recount her experience growing up with her grandmother. And one of the defining kind of experiences that she talks about in this chapter is how when she was in college, she came home to Hazelhurst one summer, and she was exploring the town, and specifically exploring parts of the town that told stories about the way that her grandmother lived and the way that her grandmother grew up. It explored the parts of towns that had records of families and cities, city events, and public kind of disputes, and how she was intentionally focusing her trip to Hazelhurst back in college. She was intentionally focusing it on the history of race relations. And she talks about how her grandmother, she lived through this, so she took Emily around, but she was ultimately very hesitant to be doing so because her grandmother did not enjoy this experience that Emily is indulging in from an outside perspective. And it's kind of painful for Emily's grandmother to relive this. So the first time, or the first couple things that Emily talks about is how Emily wanted to go to a Black Baptist church congregation to kind of experience that type of thing, and how Emily notes that how this was an extremely important part of her grandmother's life and her grandmother's community, because it was like a safe place for people to express their emotions that weren't just limited to their happy emotions, that everybody encourages people to express their happy emotions, but a church is a place where you can express your sorrow. I thought that was really interesting. I think it kind of says something about the role of the kind of like Black churches and the communities that they provided, because for so many people going through certain parts of American history were nothing short of a religious experience, and not in a good way. It was religiously dark. It was like you were seeing the darkest side of humanity, and you needed some kind of religion to get through it. So I thought that was really interesting. But again, her grandmother was skeptical because Emily wasn't going for that reason. She was going more to learn about it. Emily then starts to talk about how her grandmother and her grandfather met in a very sort of unideal situation. They snuck off and quietly got married without the approval, it sounds like, of either of their family's parents. And Emily's grandmother did it solely for the reason of escaping Hazelhurst and getting out of town. So when Emily's grandmother, she's young, she marries Julius Jefferson, And we see a little bit of where Emily gets her sort of like ambitious fighting attitude, because Emily's grandmother was very ambitious, and she was essentially just driven to get out of this small town that she had been born into, and how it never really folded out the way that she planned. She moved to Chicago initially to try and get away. After the marriage fell through, she moved to Chicago. Then she couldn't find work, so she moved to Los Angeles, where again she could not find suitable work. And feeling a little defeated, she came back to Hazelhurst, and she settled down again with Julius. And this time they were committed to sort of doing things correctly, I guess you could say. They wanted to build a house, wanted to raise kids, and even though they were married, they were not necessarily happily married, but that was just something that Emily's grandmother sort of surrendered to, and she had access to a person who could buy land, which is super sad. And she was able to start a job and, set up some kind of stability. So Emily then starts to talk about her grandmother's experience living through the civil rights era, and how it was extremely tumultuous, because when Emily's grandmother in about 1965, she was living with Julius, who is described to be sort of lazy and really well set up. He was well off. He had land. I thought it was interesting that he decided to get involved in the protests and the activism that was going on, and he put himself at risk to make sure that the community sort of advanced and got better in a way. So I thought that that was really interesting to hear about her grandfather. Another thing that I thought was really interesting was the violence that she talks about. Emily's grandfather had to sit in a rocking chair throughout the night with a rifle balanced on his lap because people had made threats to his daughter. Emily then talks about how his grandfather, even back in 1965, during the protests, he had to make like weird decisions about how to express themselves. In an ideal way, political expression would be as clear and as unencumbered as possible. But the way that they had to do it, even in 1965, was they had to be aware of this overall narrative, and they had to utilize the fact that Julius was sort of more mingled with the white members of their community than others, and how they had to play to that advantage in order to keep things civil and safe. And it's really cool, but it's just a little sad. This is kind of like a strategic game of chess. The challenge has been figuring this out, and it's way too hard for any one person to figure out. So it's really sad to see that, and see his family put in danger for these good actions that he's doing. They settled down, they built a house, and they raised their daughters. And that sort of brings us to present day, I believe, if I'm not missing anything. But she talks about how the civil rights era was a really tumultuous time for her and her family, and how it kind of left a scar on the community down there. A couple of things that I wanted to note about this chapter was how she says that during during the 2008 election when President Obama was elected, the Hazelhurst newspaper did not really mention anything about it. Nothing celebrating this, nothing really even acknowledging it. The only thing that they wrote about was the aftermath of how people were so divided by the tense environment that was created over this election. 2008, they were still just like this divided community, two different people with two different histories, and it's just really sad, overall. Another thing that I thought was interesting was that how the experience with these political Ranger, I'm sorry, that's my dog. The experience with these political clashes left such a bad taste in Emily's family's mouth that they're kind of apolitical, to the point where when Jesse Jackson was running for his second presidential campaign, it started a fight between Emily and her grandmother because it was just still such a divisive topic, black people in politics, and sort of like bringing race relations to the front of people's minds in America, and how Emily's grandmother thinks it's just best not to bring that up, So I think that kind of speaks to the pain that goes into this. We also hear, I'm going on so long, I'm so sorry, but we also hear that Emily's grandmother, who was this elegant, hardened, strong person, would have to humbly sit and wait patiently while other white customers were served first, and how this is just uncharacteristic for her, but it's what the environment demands. Another thing that I thought was really interesting that was mentioned in this chapter was how even to this day, when Emily is writing, she is in the downtown square and she goes past a Confederate soldier memorial, and that's just crazy because I don't know when this book was published, but like nowadays it looks like it's being dealt with in a different way. At least it's a little bit more informed perhaps by lawmakers, but it's just like this is still a part of the community. Yeah. So I guess to quickly connect some things, I think one of the most important kind of like messages that Emily sends in this chapter is at one point she talks about her grandmother, and her grandmother just had this sort of like bitterness that she had inherited from just experiencing all this stuff, and how her grandmother says at one point, I guess I never really loved anyone. And I thought that was really powerful, because I think a message that Emily continues to send in these essays is that love is something that you have to be conscious of and that you have to strive for. Because if you don't strive for it, it doesn't just come out of nowhere. And so I think that there's a really beautiful message in that, and it kind of speaks to how Emily's grandmother was difficult to work with throughout all of this process. And that's not her fault, but essentially it's just like you have to force yourself to look for the good in other people and the good in some stuff, or else you will be sort of alone and sort of like not fulfilled with love. So I'm very sorry for how long this assignment went on. Please do not deduct points or do deduct points. There's just a lot of content in this chapter. It's definitely the longest chapter so far. I really enjoyed reading about it. It was really heavy, and it was just really like detail packed. So I I already did a couple of shoots for this video. They were all longer than this, so I just tried to speed run everything that I thought was interesting and notable. Also, I apologize about my dog. He just wants some attention, so I'm gonna go ahead and give that to him. Thank you. Yeah, let's see where this book wraps up. Yeah, thank you.